Shadow, a German Shepherd once trained as a military working dog, was known for his exceptional skills and unwavering loyalty. He had served alongside his handler for years, facing danger and surviving countless missions. But everything changed the day he lost the person he trusted most. His handler had been killed in action, and Shadow had witnessed it all, helpless, unable to protect the one who had been his guide, his friend, his family. After that day, Shadow was never the same. Something inside him broke. He became restless, aggressive, and unpredictable. The once disciplined soldier now growled at anyone who came near, his eyes filled with mistrust and grief. The trainers at the rehabilitation center tried to work with him, but nothing seemed to calm his violent outbursts. He snapped at handlers, refused to obey commands, and isolated himself from both humans and other dogs. No one could reach him. No one could break through the wall of pain he had built around himself. The decision was made: Shadow was too dangerous to be rehomed. The facility scheduled him for euthanasia, believing there was no other choice. To them, he was no longer the brave, noble protector he had once been. He was a threat, a liability. His fate seemed sealed. But then came Emma. She was small, barely 10 years old, with a quiet presence that made people underestimate her. Unlike the others, she wasn't afraid. She didn't flinch when she saw Shadow's snarling teeth or hear the deep growls rumbling from his chest. Instead, she simply sat outside his cage, day after day, whispering softly, offering him pieces of food, and waiting. At first, Shadow ignored her. He lay curled in the corner of his kennel, his body tense, his ears flattened in distrust. But Emma was patient. She didn't force him, didn't push. She just existed beside him, her presence calm and steady. And then, one day, something changed. Shadow lifted his head. His ears twitched. His sharp, wary eyes met Emma's soft, fearless gaze. For the first time in months, he didn't growl. He didn't snarl. He simply watched. A connection had been made. A fragile, uncertain bond, but a bond nonetheless. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was enough to save him. Lily had not spoken a single word in over a year. The silence had settled over her like a thick, unrelenting fog the night of the accident, the night she lost everything. The flashing red and blue lights, the sound of sirens cutting through the rain, the metallic scent of blood in the air. The images replayed in her mind like a cruel, never-ending film. And then, after it all, there was only silence. At first, people had tried to coax words out of her. The doctors, speaking in gentle voices, had asked her questions she refused to answer. The therapists had shown her pictures, played soft music, read stories. Her foster parents, kind people with warm smiles, had reassured her, given her time. But time did nothing. The words had disappeared, buried somewhere so deep inside her that she wasn't sure if they would ever return. Most people gave up. They started whispering around her, calling it selective mutism, a trauma response. But to Lily, it was more than that. Words had lost their meaning. Why speak, when the world had taken away the very people who used to listen? Then one day, she met Shadow. The German Shepherd sat at the very end of the row of kennels in the rescue center, his fur dull, his ribs faintly visible beneath his thick coat. A small sign hung outside his cage, *aggressive. Unadoptable, *. People passed by him quickly, giving him cautious glances, whispering about his past. But Lily didn't walk away. She stood in front of the kennel, her small hands gripping the bars as she looked into Shadow's golden brown eyes. They weren't the eyes of a dangerous animal. They were the eyes of something broken, something lost, just like her. For weeks, she came back. Every afternoon, she would sit outside his cage, her legs crossed, her hands folded in her lap. She never tried to touch him. She never tried to force herself into his space. She simply sat there, silent, watching. At first, Shadow growled, his ears pinned back, his body tense. But over time, the growls grew softer. His ears twitched when she arrived, his tail flicked ever so slightly. It was the closest thing to trust he had shown in months. One evening, as the sun cast golden light through the metal bars, Shadow finally moved. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the girl who had sat with him day after day. Lily held her breath, her fingers tightening in her lap. Then, with the gentlest of touches, Shadow pressed his cold, wet nose against her hand. Something inside Lily shifted. A lump formed in her throat, her eyes burned, but for the first time in so long, she didn't feel empty. The workers at the shelter watched in stunned silence. The dangerous, unpredictable dog had chosen her. And then, in a voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind, Lily spoke. Her lips trembled, her throat ached from disuse, but the word came out, shaky but clear. Shadow. It was just one word. But in that moment, it meant everything. The silence had finally been broken. The city never truly slept. Even at this late hour, the streets pulsed with life, cars sped past, their headlights cutting through the misty air, and distant laughter echoed from a nearby bar. Neon lights flickered against rain-slicked sidewalks, casting a colorful glow that failed to warm the cold night. Ethan walked through it all, lost in his own thoughts, barely noticing the world around him. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his worn leather jacket, shoulders hunched against the chill. His mind was a storm of worries, unpaid bills, the job interview he had botched that morning, the overwhelming sense of isolation that had become his constant companion. He had stopped believing in luck, in fate, in anything that suggested life was more than a series of meaningless struggles. And then, in an instant, everything changed. He stepped off the curb at 5th and Main without thinking, without looking. A sudden burst of headlights flooded his vision, accompanied by the blaring horn of a speeding car. His body locked up, too slow to react, too frozen in place to save himself. Then, out of nowhere, a force yanked him back. A woman. She grabbed his arm and pulled him with such strength that he stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. The car roared past, the wind from its speed whipping against his face, the screech of tires echoing in his ears. His heart slammed against his ribs, the reality of how close he had come to disaster sinking in. For a long moment, he could only stare at her. She stood in front of him, breathing hard, her grip still firm on his arm. In the dim glow of a street lamp, he saw her face, dark eyes wide with alarm, her lips slightly parted as if she, too, couldn't believe what had just happened. Strands of damp hair clung to her face, her coat fluttering slightly in the breeze. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent, as if she needed to hear the answer just as much as he did. Ethan forced himself to breathe, to blink, to register that he was still standing. "Yeah. I think so," he said, his voice hoarse. A shaky laugh escaped him, more from disbelief than humor. That was really close. Her fingers slowly released their grip, but he could still feel the warmth of her touch, grounding him. "You should be more careful," she said, offering a small, knowing smile. He wanted to say something more, wanted to thank her, ask for her name, hold on to this moment for just a little longer, but before he could, she took a step back. And then another. And just like that, she was gone, disappearing into the moving crowd as if she had never been there at all. Ethan remained standing on the sidewalk, the world around him continuing as if nothing had happened. But he knew something had. He knew that in the span of mere seconds, a stranger had changed everything. He had never believed in fate. But now, for the first time in a long time, he wanted to. Sophie had always carried her pain in silence. The wounds of the past were not just scars on her heart but shadows that followed her every step, whispering doubts, fears, and regrets. For years, she had lived in survival mode, pushing forward without truly living. She had learned to smile when needed, to nod at the right moments, to appear fine even when she was drowning. But deep inside, she knew something was broken. And she wasn't sure if it could ever be whole again. Then, one evening, standing by her window, she felt a shift. Maybe it was the way the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, or maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying her burdens for so long. But in that moment, she made a quiet promise to herself, She would try to heal, to fight, to reclaim the parts of herself she had lost. The first steps were the hardest. Therapy was terrifying. Sitting in that unfamiliar room, staring at the woman across from her, she felt exposed, vulnerable, afraid. Speaking the words she had buried for so long felt like tearing open old wounds. There were moments she wanted to run, to escape before the emotions became unbearable. But then, something strange happened. The more she spoke, the lighter she felt. The weight she had carried for years, grief, guilt, shame, began to loosen, little by little. Journaling became her refuge. Each night, she poured her soul onto the pages, unraveling the chaos in her mind. Some nights, the words flowed freely, other nights, she could only manage a single sentence. But even that was progress. She also began to rediscover the world around her. The things she had once loved, music, painting, walking in the rain, no longer felt out of reach. One afternoon, she picked up a paintbrush for the first time in years. Her hands trembled as she made the first stroke, but as the colors bled onto the canvas, something inside her stirred. It was as if, through art, she was piecing herself back together. Healing wasn't a straight path. Some days, she felt strong, hopeful, almost free. Other days, the past clawed at her, trying to pull her back into the darkness. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep, mornings when she struggled to get out of bed. But now, she fought back. She reminded herself of how far she had come, of the battles she had already won. One evening, as she walked through the park, she stopped to watch the sunset. The sky was painted in gold, pink, and deep violet. A breeze touched her skin, and for the first time in years, she felt light. Not because her past had disappeared, but because she was no longer letting it define her. And as she stood there, breathing in the fresh evening air, she realized something: she had survived. She had fought through the pain, through the darkness, through the doubt. And she had won. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. Shadow had always known that danger followed him like a phantom, lurking in the corners of his life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As a former elite agent, he had made countless enemies, ruthless men who would do anything to see him fall. But this time, the threat wasn't coming from the outside. It was within his own ranks. Someone close to him was planning his downfall, and the realization sent a slow, icy chill through his veins. It started subtly. A missing file here, an intercepted message there. At first, he chalked it up to carelessness, a mistake in the system. But then, the anomalies became too frequent to ignore. His encrypted communications were being monitored. His missions were being sabotaged. He could feel the walls closing in, but no one else seemed to notice. Or worse, they did, and they were part of it. Late one night, in the solitude of his safe house, Shadow sat in front of his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. His mind was racing, piecing together fragments of information, looking for the loose thread in the web of deception. And then, a message appeared on his screen. No sender. No traceable origin. Just 5 words, glowing like an omen in the darkness. You're running out of time. His heart pounded. This wasn't a warning, it was a death sentence. He had been in the game long enough to know what came next. The question wasn't if they would come for him. It was when. Determined to stay ahead, Shadow began retracing his steps, analyzing every mission he had worked on in the past year. Who had access to his files? Who had the power to manipulate evidence against him? The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the truth became. He wasn't just being watched, he was being set up. Someone was orchestrating this with surgical precision, framing him for crimes he hadn't committed. The agency was being fed a lie, and soon, they would come for him, believing he was the traitor. Then, the ambush happened. It was supposed to be a simple intel exchange, a routine meeting in a deserted alley. But the moment Shadow stepped into the shadows, he felt it, the suffocating stillness, the tension in the air. Too late. The first shot rang out, slicing through the silence. Shadow barely had time to react before the night exploded in gunfire. He dived behind cover, his instincts kicking in, his mind working faster than his breath. They had planned this. They knew he would come, ***. Betrayal burned in his chest, sharper than the bullets whizzing past him. Someone he trusted had led him into this trap. He couldn't afford to hesitate. With precise movements, he fought his way out, disappearing into the labyrinth of the city, leaving behind a scene of destruction. Now, he was a fugitive. The agency would hunt him. His enemies would celebrate. But they had made one fatal mistake: they underestimated him. Shadow wasn't just another operative. He was a survivor, a strategist, a ghost in the system. And if they thought they could eliminate him so easily, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, a suffocating weight that pressed down on everyone inside. The gallery was packed, reporters sat poised with their pens and cameras, eager to capture every moment of what had become one of the most sensational legal battles in recent history. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, hushed conversations filled with speculation. But at the center of it all sat Ethan Carter, his hands clasped tightly together, his jaw clenched. This wasn't just about legal technicalities. It was about his name, his reputation, his future. What had begun as a contractual dispute had evolved into something far more sinister, a ruthless campaign to destroy him. His opponents were powerful, well-connected, and merciless. They had used every trick in the book to drag him through the mud, twisting the truth and manipulating the system to turn it against him. He stole a glance at Claire Donovan, his attorney. She sat beside him, calm and composed, her sharp eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. Claire was one of the best litigators in the country, smart, relentless, and unshakable in the courtroom. If anyone could turn the tide in his favor, it was her. "All rise," the bailiff's voice rang out. The room fell silent as Judge Henry Wilson entered. His stern gaze swept across the room before he took his seat behind the bench. "This court is now in session," the judge announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Claire stood, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer before stepping forward. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady, commanding attention. "What we have here is not just a corporate dispute. This is a battle between truth and deception, between integrity and corruption." Across the room, the lead attorney for the opposition leaned back in his chair, a smug smirk playing on his lips. He and his team exuded confidence, as if the verdict was already in their favor. They had money, influence, and resources Ethan could only dream of. They had buried him in false allegations, paid off witnesses, and twisted every piece of evidence to paint him as the villain. But they had underestimated him. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. Some hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, torn between telling the truth and protecting their own interests. Others lied effortlessly, their rehearsed statements weaving a narrative designed to convict him. Ethan clenched his fists under the table, forcing himself to remain calm. He could see through their fabrications, but the real question was, could the jury? Then came the moment of reckoning. Claire's team had been relentless in their investigation, and it had finally paid off. A critical piece of evidence, buried deep, concealed by layers of deception, was unearthed. A recorded conversation, a paper trail, an incriminating email that contradicted everything the opposition had claimed. Claire rose again, holding the document in her hand. "Your Honor," she said, stepping toward the jury. "This changes everything." The lead attorney for the opposition visibly stiffened. For the first time, the confidence in his eyes wavered. A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom as the evidence was presented. Ethan held his breath. Judge Wilson studied the document, his expression unreadable. The jury leaned in, their eyes scanning the details, their expressions shifting as the truth dawned on them. When the closing arguments began, Claire delivered the final blow. "Justice is not a game to be played by the powerful," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "The law exists to serve the truth, not to be manipulated by those who think they are untouchable. The question before you is simple: will you allow deception to win, or will you uphold justice?" The jury deliberated for hours. The wait was excruciating. Ethan sat frozen, every muscle in his body wound tight. He had come too far to lose now. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom held its breath. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant not guilty." Relief crashed over Ethan like a tidal wave. He exhaled, his shoulders finally loosening as Claire gave him a small nod of victory. Around him, the courtroom erupted, some in outrage, others in triumph. His enemies had lost. This time, justice had prevailed. But as he stepped outside into the blinding flash of cameras and the barrage of reporters' questions, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this wasn't the end. This war was far from over. The afternoon sun bathed the courthouse steps in a golden glow as Ethan Carter stepped outside, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe freely. The months, no, years, of struggle had finally come to an end. The battle had been brutal, exhausting, and at times, it had pushed him to the edge. But in the end, justice had prevailed. He had won. His heart pounded as he took in the scene before him. A sea of reporters and onlookers gathered, their voices merging into a dull roar. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in his direction, and a barrage of questions filled the air. Yet, none of it mattered to him at that moment. He had fought. He had suffered. And now, he was free. Beside him, Claire Donovan, his fierce and unwavering attorney, let out a small sigh of relief. She turned to him with a smirk, her sharp blue eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I told you we'd win," she said, her voice carrying a rare warmth. Ethan let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head. "I never doubted you," he admitted. That wasn't entirely true. There had been nights when he had lain awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he would ever escape the nightmare that had consumed his life. There had been moments when he had felt the crushing weight of despair, convinced that the truth alone wouldn't be enough. But Claire had stood by him, unwavering, fighting for him when he had almost lost the will to fight for himself. The crowd surged closer, desperate for a statement, but Ethan's focus shifted beyond them. His sister, Lily, stood near the courthouse steps, her hands pressed together as if in silent prayer. Her dark eyes shimmered with tears, her lips trembling as she tried to contain her emotions. The moment their gazes met, she broke into a run, her heels clicking against the pavement as she threw herself into his arms. "It's over," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly as if afraid she might disappear. "It's over," he echoed, his voice thick with emotion. For so long, he had dreamed of this moment, of finally stepping out of the shadow of false accusations, of reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him. And yet, now that it was here, it felt almost surreal. As he pulled away, he glanced up at the sky. The storm that had raged inside him for years had finally passed, leaving behind a strange but welcome sense of peace. He was no longer a man haunted by his past, he was a man stepping into his future. Claire cleared her throat, drawing his attention back. "So, what now, Carter?" she asked, crossing her arms. Ethan exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. The possibilities stretched out before him, endless and full of promise. He didn't know exactly where life would take him next, but for the first time in years, he had the freedom to decide. "I think," he said, a small smile forming on his lips, "it's time to start over." And with that, he stepped forward, leaving the courthouse behind. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. This was not just the end of his fight. This was a beautiful beginning.